In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world one launch code away from full-on nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. This documentary series will cover that crisis one day at a time. But first, we're releasing two preludes to the crisis to set the stage. Here comes part one. This is Time Ghost, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm Indy Neidell. Never before and never since has that possibility of our world being suddenly destroyed been so close. In the 55 years since it happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis and its aftermath have been analyzed in books, dissertations, fictional films, and documentaries. But as more of the actual source documents were made public the past 25 years, the story looks significantly different from both sides' original official versions. To understand the missile crisis, we first have to look at where the two superpowers stood in 1962. The capitalist and communist systems of the two had been in opposition from the day the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917. The Soviets saw the capitalist system as a scourge of humanity that needed to be eliminated. On the American side, the communist system was seen as a direct threat to the American way of life.
We believe in freedom. Freedom for these people, for ourselves, for everyone. We want freedom, not tyranny.
The persecution of communists in the States during the Cold War and McCarthyism are well known. But this started already in the 1920s with the Red Scare, when thousands of American communists were prosecuted and incarcerated for their political beliefs. The hatchet was briefly buried when the two became allies against Germany in the Second World War, but it was dug up as that war ended.
I believe that 95% of the people in California are decent, honest American citizens. The Communist Party is a minority, but a dangerous minority.
It was an ideological battle on which the survival of the system depended, and in 1962 it was unclear who would prevail.
It is total competition with an antagonist who is putting into it everything within his capability. It is not a conflict between peoples, but between basic values and systems of government.
The Western world, led by the United States, was establishing a system of more or less free trade and alliances based on independence, inclusion, and personal freedoms. The goal was peace and prosperity.
I'm John Wayne. Is there any better or equal hope in the world, Lincoln asked, than the ultimate justice of the people? We Americans believe there is not. The stonework of our national life is made of this belief. We believe in many things, but this belief that man is a responsible being bears out our own unique stamp as a nation. As a people, we are active and often noisy. We are industrious, oftentimes to the bafflement of ourselves and our friends.
The communist world, led by the Soviet Union, though initially in cooperation with China, was developing a system of planned economy and regulated trade that depended on expanding the communist system to client states under Soviet or Chinese control. The goal was peace and prosperity.
We must create a whole new generation of mechanics, Stalin said. In 1928, the first of a series of large-scale 5-year plans was begun. And by 1940, Russia was far different from the land of the Tsars.
As World War II ended, many of the Eastern and Central European countries that had been invaded by Germany and then liberated by Russia's Red Army fell under Soviet control. The Soviet Union also maintained control of East Germany when Germany was split into East and West, but this was only the beginning of Soviet expansion. Under communist doctrine, the Soviet Union theoretically strove for a world without borders, controlled by the dictatorship of the proletariat. To achieve this, it seeded and supported communist revolutions wherever possible. This was a direct threat to the democratic principles of much of the Western world. So the U.S. instituted a policy of global containment, supporting and financing anti-communist movements in Europe, former African and Asian colonies, and Latin America. Now, that was an expansion of the Monroe Doctrine, formulated by President James Monroe and his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams in 1823, stating that European colonialism in the Americas would not be accepted and would be actively opposed by the United States. The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. We could not view any interposition for the purposes of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. The Monroe Doctrine hadn't applied to anywhere outside the Americas, but the U.S. now started to apply the spirit of it to the entire world, though its direct application within the Americas would prove critical to the events leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the crisis itself. This web of principles and theories brought the two superpowers into direct conflict all over the world and provided the basis on which the Cold War would be fought. It led to a long series of proxy wars, covert operations of influence, and fanning of regional conflicts to further the interests of each side. In early 1948, the first major confrontations arose when the democracy in Czechoslovakia was overthrown in a communist coup backed by the Soviets, and the Western Allies decided to introduce the new Deutschmark as the currency in Berlin. Now, Berlin at the time was divided into 4 zones of military control between France, Great Britain, the US, and the Soviets. But the city was still governed as one unit by the local powers, right? The introduction of a new currency was a direct threat to Soviet economic control over the city. Up to this time, President Harry Truman and the U.S. had not decided what to do with Berlin. They weren't even sure if they would keep armed forces within the city. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, though, had decided his gang would keep control over all of East Germany, including Berlin, and milk it for as many resources as possible. They had actually managed to turn their zone's population against them by plundering industrial resources, forcibly deporting workers, and even transporting whole factories to Russian territory. France and Great Britain, for their part, were staunchly opposed to a Soviet Berlin and pressured the U.S. to hold out against the Russians, and officially, everyone was striving for a reunited Germany with Berlin as its capital. In an attempt to stop the Deutschmark, Stalin ordered a full blockade of the city so that no food, material, or supplies could be brought in. The Allies responded by creating an air bridge into the city, flying in enough food and materials to keep the city alive. The Berlin airlift eventually brought in so many supplies that Stalin gave up, and the blockade was practically over by May 1949, though officially it was lifted in September. But both sides moved to assert their control over Germany. First, the Federal Republic of Germany was created as a democratic state May 5, 1949. Then, on October 7th, the SED, the East German Communist Party, proclaimed the German Democratic Republic, which, despite its name, was a satellite state to the Soviet Union. With all of this, the threat that the Soviet Union was to the West was now tangible and immediate. It drove the Western Allies closer together, and they created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. A similar situation to Germany also existed in Korea. After being liberated from Japan during World War II, Korea had been split into North, under Soviet control, and South, under U.S. control, both claiming sovereignty over each other's territory. The attempt to create 2 independent states failed in 1950 when the North invaded the South and the Korean War broke out. While the Soviets and Chinese backed the North, a large part of the rest of the world united in a defense of the South in a combined intervention under the United Nations flag. Ostensibly, the war was between an independent North and a UN-backed South. In reality, China and the Soviet Union gave extensive support to the North, and 88% of the UN forces for the South were from the US. The war even actually saw direct battle between Russians and Americans as Soviet airmen fought their US Air Force counterparts in the skies of Korea. 3 years of bloody war ended with a divided Korea along the line of the DMZ, not too different from the Strait Division along the 38th parallel where they had begun in 1950. Meanwhile, in Europe, the conflict around West and East Germany continued to escalate. In 1952, the Soviet Union proposed the reunification of Germany as a free democratic state on condition that the new Germany would remain neutral and not be allowed to join NATO. West Germany refused, fearing that the Soviets would not stick to their promises of allowing the new country independence. Now, to what extent the proposal truly came from the Soviets or was an East German initiative, and if so, was a missed opportunity for genuine reunification, is still an issue of debate. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union proposed that it too should join NATO to preserve peace in Europe. The US and the UK rejected this, seeing it as an attempt to curtail the buildup of NATO forces in Europe. Instead, they moved to include West Germany in NATO, and the Soviet reaction was to form the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This effectively joined the Soviet Union and 7 Central and Eastern European satellite states into a single cohesive military force. On paper, the two blocs were now in a state of power balance, but only if you didn't consider the nuclear arms race. The Soviets had already begun developing nuclear arms during World War II, but it would take until 1949 for them to develop a functional atom bomb to test. The US was well aware of Soviet efforts, and in response, increased its nuclear program from an estimated 13 warheads in 1947 to 2,422 by 1955. In the same time frame, the Soviets were able to increase their arsenal to 200. The US was clearly ahead. By the time John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as U.S. president in 1961, the United States had an estimated 22,229 operational warheads, while the Soviets possessed just 2,492. Furthermore, the deployment systems of the United States were so much more advanced that the Russians stood no realistic chance of launching a first strike that would lead to anything other than immediate self-destruction. JFK knew this. The by now sole leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, knew this. The military commanders on both sides knew this. The KGB and the CIA knew this, but the American and the Soviet public did not, and this would prove crucial in the crisis to come. Meanwhile, in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and Europe, the dance of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary actions went on. 4 of these hotspots would prove critical for Kennedy: Berlin, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. The developments in Southeast Asia in the 1950s led to the domino theory, formulated by President Dwight Eisenhower in 1954. It stated that if one country in a region were allowed to fall to communism, then the rest would swiftly follow. Now, the Laotian Civil War was a proxy war that neither the Soviets nor the US was really keen on fighting, but still had to stay engaged with. That war broke out in 1953, but would soon spill into the Vietnam War, which began 2 years later, which in turn would partly reignite the Korean War, and it looked more and more like the domino theory was correct. So after New Year's 1959, when Fidel Castro rather unexpectedly succeeded with the Cuban Revolution, the US felt they had all the reason in the world to fear a communist surge in their own backyard, and that it needed to be stopped as swiftly as possible. Still, gotta point one thing out here, that the Western powers under US leadership had more money than the Soviet Union, more resources, and outpowered it in nuclear arms by a factor of 10. And yet, both sides were capable of destroying the world. And now, here we stand as the 1960s are about to begin, with them facing each other ever more warily over a world ever more divided in two, and that world would very soon be on the brink of nuclear holocaust. In Prelude Part 2, we'll follow the specific events leading right up to the actual crisis. Click subscribe to never miss an episode of this whole series, as well as all the other awesome Time Ghost series we'll produce in the future. And if you'd like to help us create more and better content, please support us on Patreon. The Patreon link is below, as well as links to some of our sources for this series that use, or are, material on the Cuban Missile Crisis that was unavailable to the public for many years. Good night, and good luck.